All right. So today we're going to talk a little bit about, ultimately move towards talking about a sort of Catholic understanding of the separation of church and state. And we're going to kind of lay like foundation work for the rest of the semester, obviously. But also to kind of motivate you all to learn this stuff. Because I think there's a tendency. So one of you guys know The City of God that Augustine wrote, right? It's like a big, thick book, right? Like over 1,000 pages. And I think it's the oldest, like, full manuscript that we have, like non-biblical, of like a single argument all the way through. But anyway, so Augustine wrote that in pieces. And he basically starts out, his whole thing is that the people of Rome are blaming the Christians for the collapse of Rome. And they're blaming them basically on two fronts. First, that because they didn't pray to the Roman gods, the gods got mad, and there's sort of this retribution against the Romans. And so Augustine sets out to kind of refute that. And then the second thing is that he says that they're accused of being too otherworldly, like caring about the next life and not this life. And so Augustine sets out to show why they're wrong on both counts. All right, and he keeps adding, because people will argue with him, and then he'll put out another book, and by the end he gets to 22 books. And we have this big, long thing. But, I mean, we'll talk more about this probably next week, or the next time we meet. But in it, he sort of lays out all the foundational stuff for Christian political philosophy, like how we as Catholics are supposed to act when it comes to politics. So what I want to do before we sort of dive into it is talk a little bit about motivation, because there's this tendency, like that accusation that they made that the Christians were too overly focused on the other world and wanted nothing to do with politics. I'm sure as there are people who would look at this topic and go, I don't want to hear that. What does that have to do with faith, right? So what I want to do is sort of put it in this it's the Catholic principle, right? Both end, right? We don't throw stuff away, right? It's body and soul, not one or the other. So politics has a place. It's a lesser place. But if we're not careful, and if we don't, as Christians, engage, then it becomes all-encompassing, right? And then the state becomes the Messiah, not Jesus. All right. So let's talk a little bit about why we're here. And I think this quote I'm going to read it slow, but I want you to kind of just imbibe this a little bit and think about this. This is Cardinal Piet was a 18th or a 19th, early 20th century cardinal in the church, who devoted a lot of time in writing on the Kingship of Christ. Okay, so he really thought about, okay, what does it mean for Christ to reign? And so we're going to sort of build on what he's saying here. But I want you to think about this, what he's saying. He says, if we suppose Catholic social institutions with our Lord no longer living in the hearts of the individual members of society, then religion is merely a signboard which will soon disappear. It's like, okay, so if individual people don't have Jesus in their heart, eventually religion goes away. But on the other hand, try to convert individuals without Catholicizing the social institutions, and your work is without stability. So what does he mean by that? So he means if all of the social institutions don't support the Catholic worldview and don't support, so you evangelize someone, they go out in the world and the world picks them back off, right? So what he's saying is he's putting this framework of saying the political institutions, all the institutions in the culture are meant to reinforce what the gospel says, right? Not meant to replace the gospel, not meant to build some utopia, it never happened. But nevertheless, it should be pulling in the same direction, all right? Making it really easy for people to, so for example, how many people are probably pro-choice just because it's legal, right? They're just like, well, it's legal, so it must be okay, right? Flip that around, right? So how many people if you really thought about why certain things like murder are wrong? If people aren't going to really think about it, they're going to go, well, it's illegal, right? And because they sort of imbibe the sort of cultural norms around it. And so if you don't evangelize the culture, and you don't set up institutions within the culture that are distinctly Catholic, and definitely Catholic, not just Christian, then it makes it extremely hard to evangelize, and then also to actually help get people to heaven. Yes, Casey?
What do you mean by institutions?
So institutions could be anything in between. So we'll talk more about this. So we're going to talk more about the state today as a sort of an institution. But the family isn't like, it's between institutions are anything that goes between the family and the state, right? So CCM is a mediating institution, right? So things like that, okay? This university is a mediating institution, all right? What are you going to say, Andrew?
Just build on that. Sort of like in like hospitals, schools,
university. Yeah, so like anything that brings people together, where they we'll talk more about this. So they have a common good, which they're aiming towards, and they all love. The point is that how many of you guys know about the Benedict option? You ever heard of this? Okay, so Casey knows about the Benedict option. Okay, so the Benedict option is there is this movement in the church to do what St. Benedict did. And what St. Benedict did was he sort of retreated from the culture and started Western monasticism. And he kept what was good in the culture. And, he had scribes keeping what was good in the culture. He lived out what was good in the culture. And towns would grow up around the monasteries, right? So this is sort of like a ghetto effect, right? And so what the movement is to sort of use that as a model to go back to, right? So we say, okay, well, what we need to do is get all of these sort of supporting institutions for Catholics where we can sort of get together and then expand out from there, okay? And that's a good plan. It's not, but the problem with that, though, is that we also need our Josephs and our Esthers, right? Joseph goes in and what does he do? Like he gets into the institution itself and infects it, right? And so we need both, right? And most of you studying now are going to have to go in it and infect the culture, all right? Or the culture will infect you. It's up to you, right? But so you have to resolve that, okay, I'm going to infect the culture. And that's what his point is here, right? So we have to understand then how the social institutions, how they work, but also what they should look like, all right? And what structure, how they should be structured, so that it makes it easy for someone when they hear the gospel and they accept the gospel to live the gospel out. Okay, and that is the basis. Like you'll hear people talk about Christendom, right? Christendom was sort of the time between like 800 and maybe up to the Reformation, right? And that was simply church and state, king and pope pulling in the same direction, right? All caring about now. There were corrupt kings and all that, because there's going to be. But the point is that if a king did something contrary to the faith, and the Pope excommunicated him, the people were no longer bound to obey that. So guess what he did? Like he knew his soul had to be saved too. All right, and we can now look in the other direction when all that falls apart. Right? How many politicians act as if their souls too need to be saved? Okay, because if they did, then there would be something above them. All right, so that's the general idea. So we have to have a good idea of how the structures are and how the culture is, and then set about Catholicizing it. And then the point is that everything we'll talk about this semester will actually be how you Catholicize every aspect of the state, especially, but the culture as a whole. Okay, sound good? All right. So we're sort of on the same page. This is pretty important stuff, right? And obviously, choosing it, the timing. Is providential because with the presidential election coming up, many of you probably this may be your first one you've ever kind of voted in, but it gets kind of ugly. Just going to warn you. But understanding like why you should vote in certain ways, why you should support certain candidates, why you should support certain things and not other certain things. All of those things are important, not only for yourself but to be able to talk to people and engage. Okay. And then understanding the bigger providential timing of it, we can get in the habit of like kind of being, I don't know, like prophets of gloom, where we're like, oh, things are just so bad, like I'm just getting away, right? The danger in doing that is that from all eternity, God chose each and every one of us to put us in this place at this time, right? And it wasn't so that we could hide out till we get to heaven, I promise. Right, and so we have to arm ourselves to be able to do that. All right. So finishing his quote, the structure you erect in the morning, others will tear down in the evening. Okay, so he's still back talking about the institutions, whether they support what we're doing or not. Is not the strategy of the enemies of God there to teach us a lesson. They want to destroy the faith in the hearts of individuals, it is true, but they direct still more vigorous efforts to the extirpation of religion from social institutions. Even one defeat of God in this domain means the weakening, if not the ruin, of the faith in the souls of many. Okay? So that's the way that we reach many people. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the schedule, and only because I know Keegan really likes when you give a syllabus. But also because if there's something like you want me to put in here, tell me. Again, this is more for your benefit than for mine. All right, so today we're gonna talk about the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of men. Think in terms of church-state relations. Okay. Next time we meet, we're going to talk about the Catholic founding of America. And in this respect, what we're going to do is look at things, and we're going to use Augustine City of God to look at things historically. All right? Because if we look at Columbus, Cortez, and then Our Lady of Guadalupe especially, and then look as Catholics came north, we can, especially with Our Lady appearing in Mexico, we can begin to get a glimpse of God's plan for America. Okay? That's the purpose of history, right? History is all God's story. So if we can sort of understand history, and not surprisingly, probably a lot of what we'll talk about is going to be absolutely contrary to what you were taught. Okay? Not surprising, because one of the ways in which to attack the church is to attack her history. All right? I'm not going to no one's going to canonize Columbus or Cortez, but I guarantee you when you sort of when you pull away the surface, you can easily put yourself in their position and sort of think about their motivation, where they failed, and all of that. But nevertheless, and why it took an apparition of Our Lady to clean up the places that they did fail. So we'll talk about that, and that'll sort of make us sort of understand mission, right? And then the following week, we'll just talk about Catholic social doctrine in general, just to lay down the principles so we have a language and vocabulary for the rest of the semester. Then we'll begin to look at different things. So we'll look at the American founding and the founding principles and compare them to Catholic principles that are sort of related to it. And then we will begin to look very specifically at what we believe life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness means, and what the founders believed, and what sort of modern America believes. Okay, and then we'll talk about how to essentially how democracy works in general, how it works with Catholicism, how democracy, why the church is always so hard on socialism, and especially socialism in the context of a democracy, and how the church fits into all of that. The next week we will look at economics, and we'll also talk about poverty, which is a Christian virtue, and the environment. Okay. Then religious freedom, and then we'll talk about just war and immigration, and then the last week when we meet, we'll tie it all together. Yes, Connor?
Can we talk about capitalism?
Capitalism? Yeah, it'll be in the economics, poverty, and environment will be capitalism. So that's deliberately why I led with socialism, so that we can then come back around to capitalism. Yes?
What will these primarily be drawing from? So like last time there was mainly a lot of Aquinas stuff, so like I imagine City of God.
Yeah, so probably after next time we meet, there won't be a whole lot of Augustine. It will mostly be the popes of the early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century. That is sort of that's when sort of all the elements are there, but that's when Catholic social doctrine really started. And you'll see even today when we talk about things in church and state, we'll be drawing a lot from those 3 or 4 popes from, Leo the 13th, Pius the 10th, Pius the 11th, and Pius the 12th. All of those sort of together, the church-state relations. Most of the doctrine is worked out there. Yes, Con?
Were we talking about other forms of government?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, only sort of ancillary. For the sake of sort of comparison, I have it laid out. I can certainly include, what do you have in mind?
I just would I can say in the modern world, democracy is very much held as the
the way, the government.
Yeah.
Where obviously historically that is not certainly not the case.
Yeah, we will certainly talk about monarchy and why the church would seem to lean towards that. But then within the context of how things are now, we'll spend most of the time on democracy. Or really, it's like a republic that's democratic. All right, anything else? Okay, all right, so if anything comes up you want to talk about, let me know, and we'll kind of fit it in where it needs to fit in, okay? All right, so what I did for this, you guys remember, those of you who are here, Theology of the Body, how John Paul II basically took one scripture passage, right, and then wrote for, almost a year on it, okay? So I'm going to do a little John Paul II impression, and I'm going to take 3 scripture passages and talk for an hour and a half. Isn't that great? That's awesome. So
1/300th of the way.
Yeah, I'm so totally there. So anyways, that's what we're going to do. We're going to get 3 scripture passages that are sort of not completely not misunderstood, but that we need to dive a little deeper on that relate exactly to this topic. All right, so. All right, so the first is Jesus in front of Pilate, okay? And he says, you guys all know this, my kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom did belong to this world, my attendants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not here. So Pilate said to him, then you are a king. Jesus answered, you say I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. All right, so what does Jesus mean when he calls himself a king? Like, does he mean something just totally otherworldly? Or does it, when he says, my kingdom does not belong to this world, does he mean that my kingdom hasn't completely and totally infected this world yet? Right? It doesn't look like any of the kingdoms in this world, but it's coming. Right? All right, so let's just talk about it real quick, because I want to make sure that we're putting like the social justice warrior thing aside. Make sure we're very clear about the possibility of the kingdom of God coming to earth. Now, that's not possible. Okay, it's never going to be that way, because there's always going to be people like us. Okay, now there's better and worse institutions, but the fulfillment, which you guys have heard, like the church is the sign or the sacrament of salvation. The church is the sign of the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of Christ. And it's in the world, but it's not yet fully complete. Okay? All right? So I don't want us to think that, like, okay, if, again, the both end, right? That, okay, if it's not completely otherworldly, then it must be in this world. And it's really neither, or really both. Okay? And this will make more sense as we begin to talk about it. All right? All right, so how do we unpack Christ calling himself a king? All right, so Pius XI in 1925 decided, he wrote an encyclical called Quas Primus on the Kingship of Christ. And he decided that because Christ's temporal reign was not recognized in most places, so in other words, most people had sort of, when it came to governing, had thrown God out of the picture, that he would institute a liturgical feast. It was right before, initially it was right before All Saints' Day. And we'll talk about why that maybe made sense in a minute. And what he had decided to do was that rather than preach so much, he said, well, if we celebrate this thing, if we show that we believe this thing through our actions, then the graces will come and people will begin to change things, right? So it's lex credendi, lex orandi. The law of prayer is the law of belief. So the way you pray not only reveals what you believe, but also forms what you believe. Okay? So think about when you go to Mass, like how you act in the Mass actually affects how you believe, right? If I walk in and I'm chewing gum and I just plop down in the seat, well, what does that say? Well, I'm just coming here to hang out, right? Maybe I'll hang out with my homeboy Jesus. If I go in and I genuflect and I kneel in his presence, what does it say? My king is on his throne. Here I am. Okay? And the more you do that, the more it reinforces that truth to not only to yourself, but to everyone around, right? And so what the church often does when you want to form belief about things, the church will begin to celebrate it, okay? So that's his logic, all right? His logic is, okay, one of the ways we can fix this, rather than preaching it over and over and over, is to institute a feast, all right? And if you look, you'll see that very often, okay? Anyway, so he institutes this feast, and he institutes it, since it's changed to the end of the year, but he puts it right before All Saints' Day because he very deliberately wants the king to be celebrated and then all of his soldiers, okay? All right, so let's read what he said, and then we'll sort of unpack it. It would be a grave error, on the other hand, to say that Christ has no authority. So everyone would say, okay, Christ is supposed to be king of my... Here's the setting of what he's saying. Everyone would say, Christ is supposed to be king of my heart. Okay? And he's like, yep, that's true, but... And then here's his but. It would be a grave error, on the other hand, to say that Christ has no authority whatever in civil affairs, since by virtue of the absolute empire over all creatures committed to him by the Father, all things are in his power. Nevertheless, during his life on earth, he refrained from the exercise of such authority, and although he himself disdained to possess or to care for earthly goods, he did not, nor does he today, interfere with those who possess them. Okay, so certainly there's this sort of metaphorical way of looking at Jesus as the king, but it's literal too, right? What are Gabriel's message? What's Gabriel's message to Mary? He will reign. He will sit on the throne of David, right? Physical throne. Okay, and David's kingdom was where?
On earth.
Here, right? Okay. So Christ is king over every place on earth, everywhere. All right. All authority has been given to me by my Father. All right. And he reigns in the church, and he reigns in the world. All right. How does he reign? So if we split those two things up, go ahead, Ken.
I'm kind of thinking, so you might have seen this last semester, but so like all the people's power comes from God. So like if I'm obeying my authorities, like whether it's my boss or like, you know, I'm not a student anymore, but like a teacher, you know, according to, you know, the right exercise of their power over me, then I'm really obeying God, I think.
Okay, so everybody sort of grasps where he's going. We're going to talk more about this with authority in a second. But that's the general idea. All right, and that is so counter cultural, like counter how the world is now, counter how America was founded, and we'll talk about why that is in the sort of the ideas have consequences category. All right, so this picture hopefully makes a little bit of sense here. So yes, Mike.
Can you repeat what you said?
Maybe. What did I say? What Kevin said?
Yeah.
Oh, so Kevin said that all authority comes from God. So he looks at authority figures as God speaking. All right, and we'll talk about why they have to qualify. I mean, all of that, but we'll talk about that in a second. All right, so Christ is priest and king. He's also prophet, but priest and king. Okay. And so his kingship is split into two. Okay? One, he has a spiritual kingship where he reigns in the church. All right? And he reigns from the tabernacle, but also through the Pope and the bishops in union with him. Okay? But he's not just king of the church. He's king of the entire world. All right? And so he also has a temporal rulership. I guess rulership, is that a word? I don't even know if that's a word. It is now. So what we're going to really talk about is that, right? What that actually should look like, all right? What it means for Christ to rule. Rules in a similar way that he does the church, not exactly the same. There's no promise of infallibility, but nevertheless rules through secondary causes, through instruments, right? So kings and presidents and congresses, and they're his instruments, all right? And that's what I want you to sort of take home from this a little bit, is to see the instrumentality of those things, because they're instruments to make Christ known, okay? And so if you don't use the instruments, someone else will. All right, so this sort of makes sense, at least visually. Those of you guys are visual, right? So just think of it split in half. We sort of understand like how he rules in the church. Now I want us to sort of understand how he rules temporally, right? And we said, do you understand the difference between like the spiritual versus the temporal? And we're all good on that, right? And then you'll hear like secular. Everyone understand what the word secular means? I mean, secularism is bad. Secular is not. Secular just means it's stuff related to this world. Okay.
What does secularism mean?
Secularism is this world is all there is. But anything that has an ism on it besides Catholicism sometimes is scholasticism is okay too.
Monasticism.
Yeah. So always be careful of your isms. But the isms usually take something and absolutize it, right? At least the bad ones, all right? So you can think of like two sort of concentric circles, right? So Christ's kingship, and then the kingship, like his lordship of the world is the big circle, and then the inner circle is the church, where his reign is fully sort of recognized, and then it can spread or not, all right? And the goal is not to have one big church, right? Because the church doesn't, like one big church in the sense of like church ruling everything, including the secular, right? The goal is to have one big church, yes.
So
Right?
like
And,
papal states were a world, like ruled the entire world. Bad idea.
yeah, bad idea. So a world government, always a bad idea, all right? Because there's only one thing that can unite all of mankind: the church, right? Our mark is unity, right? And anytime we try to do it on our own, like it doesn't come from above, it comes from below, right? And that's why the church will always oppose one world government for that reason. Yes.
How one does a one world government have to be?
Yeah, so I would think, okay, so let me qualify what I say here. So I think you guys have all been around me enough to know, like, I'm pretty direct. So if you get insulted by something like I say, because I know politics can be like a sort of like a firecracker, like make sure you understand what I say. I try to qualify what I say. I'm not trying to insult anyone. But I want to be absolutely clear, and I want to be absolutely clear not what I think, but what the church really thinks, right? Not what people sometimes say, not even what sometimes people say that are attached to the church. I want to talk about what the church really teaches. All right, so go ahead, Connor, your question, repeat it again so that it's...
Do you want me to keep the more direct format? Or the...
No, you can go as indirect as you want. I can translate. I can be really direct from indirect too.
Is the United Nations okay?
Okay, so how one world is to one world. All right, let's start with something like the EU. All right, and then I'll sort of expand. Right, what do you guys think from a Catholic standpoint? EU good or bad? From a salvation of Europeans standpoint, EU good or bad?
We're talking about did he implement the theoretical idea of the EU or the actual?
Well, I mean, we could talk about both, because I think the answer is the same for both.
I would say from a theoretical standpoint, as you move up the chain of, I guess, more U.S., local, state, and then federal government, I wouldn't say it's necessarily bad to have more levels. It's just those levels need to be increasingly need to worry increasingly less about the minute details of citizens' lives that they promise to be solved at the lowest level possible.
Okay, so he was talking about subsidiarity, which is one of the points of this. Yes.
Good bounce off point. Obviously I don't know the ins and outs of the EU, but from my understanding of it, I would say it's good in the sense that it has a lot of benefits that benefit its citizens, but also it's united in a way that the individual countries still have levels of autonomy and they can have their own laws, and they're not unified in a way where there's like one definitive authority over all of them, the way like the president is of the United States. Like they're not as unified.
But is it moving in that direction? So you would think it's not going to start that way, right?
Right.
Well, I guess
yes. Go ahead, John Collins.
So since I work in software, a clear example of how they've acted recently is a law called GDPR, which is this like really overarching privacy law that affects every European citizen, like directly. And it's been kind of a pain for software companies. Not to say that it's like a bad idea, but I would say that's a very clear example of that particular government reaching very deeply into the personal lives of people. That's all info I have. But
Go ahead, Kevin. What were you going to say?
I guess it's hard because I'm not too sure, like, what the EU does. You know, is it like?
I don't think anybody's real sure about it.
Because it's like it's one thing if the companies are like, you know what, I'm going to get together with all these other or all these other nations, and we're just going to share best practices and like, how did this work for you? Versus like an actual entity that everyone's kind of bought into, and they like have real power, and they're like, calling the shots. That's like totally different.
All right, so we probably should come back to this when we talk about governments, but think about what's the purpose of the state? You guys remember this from last semester?
To make doing good easier?
Well, yeah, what's the purpose? Sort of. I mean, that's one of their roles. You guys remember the term of the common good? What is the common good? What is the state's role?
protect the common good.
Protect and promote the common good. When you take huge masses of people across an entire continent, can you bring them together with a single common good? Or a single set of common goods?
Depends how many, depends what they are.
So just that Europe as it is now, is there, can you take men and women of that vast different cultures and unite them by some common good, which, by the way, sort of was done before when we had Christendom, but now they want to throw those roots out. So can they be brought together? Right. Whenever you think about this, right? You think about it, it's because it's a problem for the United States too. Like, what is the common good that brings the states in the United States together, right? And we can talk more about this, but that's what I want you to begin to think about when people talk about having these sort of bringing states together. There are reasons why, not just logistical reasons, but common good reasons why that's a bad idea, right? Because what if, for example, what if some of the countries, like Great Britain, decide it's contrary to our common good to open the borders to Islam, and everyone else in the EU has decided, no, it's okay, it's good. All right, what do you do? Okay. All right, so I won't go deeply into that. When we talk about the different forms of government, we can certainly talk about that aspect of it. But the purpose is, like, anytime you bring groups of people together, the only thing that truly can unite them is some common good. All right, something that they all share it. All right. All right. So let's talk a little bit about. Let's see, I got a little distracted there. Sorry. All right. So Pope Pius XI. He's not the only one that sort of talks about this, but Pope Pius X was the first to sort of really articulate this very clearly. He thinks every sort of social problem stems from some theological heresy. Okay? You try to play the game, right? Like, how many social problems alone are caused by a lack of a belief in original sin? Just for an example, right? Or a misunderstanding of Christ's kingship, which was all about what the wars of, like, between the Catholics and the Reformed German states, and all of that was because of a misunderstanding of what it meant for Christ to be king. Okay? So Pius XI says something. Go ahead, Ken.
What did we say, or what did the Pope say too? That that the intellectual problem isn't the only problem. Like, just weak human nature also contributes to it kind of fans the flames.
Yeah, definitely. So that's why, like, even a one world government wouldn't work, right? Because who checks the one world government? Like, that's part of the genius of the American, like, experiment, is the fact that they did, maybe not deliberately, but they recognized, there's people are kind of corrupt, like, in their heart, and so we need to put checks and balances against it, right? And then if you go and you read Tocqueville when he comes to the United States, and he looks, and he's like, there's another check and balance, and it's religion, and and he thinks that the Catholic Church, because he's Catholic, has a very unique role in doing that. Okay, serving as a check and balance on the checks and balances are already in place. All right, but yeah, so checks and balances are exactly that, right? It's an admission that that people have original sin, all right, and especially when you get a group of people together and you get sort of a mob mentality going, and it really gets out of control. Okay.
And so would your point be with having multiple states being one state can be a check on the other state?
Yeah. Well, not necessarily, right? Because you got a little an issue of authority too, right?
Well, so I guess I was thinking in significance, the France and the UK and America were a check on Germany in the 1940s.
Yes. Yeah, so when they're overstepping their bounds, other states step in, right? But should a state again, this is not always clear. Should a state like America step into something going on in North Korea? All right, I'm not going to answer that question. I mean, there's obviously a lot of going on there, but where does America's sovereignty end, and where does it become where America, Woodrow Wilson wanted to spread democracy everywhere throughout the world, whether people wanted it or not. So where do those two things end? Okay. All right. So, but anyway, his point is that the problem, if you were to sort of drill down and say, okay, what's wrong with the world? And what's wrong with the world is that Christ the King has been shoved out. All right. Chief causes of the difficulties under which mankind was laboring, the manifold evil in the world, were due to the fact that the majority of men had thrust Jesus Christ and his holy law out of their lives. That these had no place either in private affairs or in politics. And we said further that as long as individuals and states refused to submit to the rule of our Savior, there would be no really hopeful prospect of a lasting peace among nations. All right. And that's so countercultural to what we think about that for a second, right? How often in the public square do you hear Jesus' name mentioned? Not. Yeah. Unfortunately, yeah. How often without a vulgarity attached to it, right? And that's bad. That's on us. All right. And for us to kowtow to sort of, because there's no peace, nothing without Jesus. Right. You have to be utterly convinced of that. Right. Even in the world, there is no peace without Jesus. All right. And so Jesus comes, and Romans had they had their sort of touch point with Caesar. Right? And we've now flipped it to sort of humanity in general ourselves, and we'll talk more about that later. But the point is that what we don't talk about enough, and I've sort of said this before when we talk about sin, right? We always talk about sin like we did this bad thing, or this bad thing does this to me, but we're not so good about going, first and foremost, it's an offense against God, right? When we talk about lying, right? People all go, oh, is this lying? Is this lying? Well, why is lying wrong? Because first and foremost, it's an offense against God, right? The provident God has set things up the way it is, right? And for me to try to create my own reality by lying, I'm going against God's providence, right? So the offense, first and foremost, even a little tiny lie, says that God, you didn't really know what you were doing, so I need to tell the situation a little differently, right? Yes, Connor.
Are we going to talk about religious pluralism in this?
Oh yeah.
Today?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Religious pluralism, basically having multiple religions. Can that work? So Pope Leo XIII said, okay, I'm really getting sick of hearing about, this person's right, this person's right. Let's start talking about the rights of God. Right? What are God's, what do we owe to God right now? Okay. And this again, sort of going back to Augustine. The Romans had a lot of sort of pride in their empire, and they were really destroyed when it fell. And Augustine's really good about sort of disavowing them of any, trying to sort of tell them otherwise that it really wasn't as great as you thought it was. And then they're like, oh, it was so just. And he's like, no, it can never be just unless you give to justice is giving to each one what he is owed. Unless you give to God what he's owed, you will never have a just society. Right. Okay. All right. So hopefully this sort of at least sets the framework for, okay, we're good. We sort of understand, okay, Christ has a role, and we'll talk about the role in a little bit, in the temporal sphere, and we can't omit him. We can't, as Christians, stand by while he's being omitted. All right, so we have to step in. All right, so let's go to the second passage. This is Pilate's response later, after Jesus comes back, and he says, "So Pilate said to him, Do you not?" So this is when Jesus is giving him the silent treatment. "Do you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to release you and I have power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me if it had not been given to you from above. For this reason, the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." Right? So you would have no power over me unless God had given it to you. Okay. So let's sort of unpack that. All right. So what we're going to talk a little bit about is authority. All right. Specifically civil authority. Here's what the Catholic understanding articulated of civil authority. It follows that all public power must proceed from God. For God alone is the true and supreme Lord of the world. Everything without exception must be subject to him and must serve him, so that whosoever holds the right to govern holds it from one sole and single source, namely, God, the sovereign ruler of all. There is no power but from God. All right, so we'll just take a historical example. Where did Henry VIII get his power from? God. Okay. Now, Henry VIII later on thought he got it from somewhere else. Now, did he get it specifically? Did God ordain from all? Was it given specifically to Henry as king, or was the authority, because of the way the structure of England was he just the instrument of God's authority?
Yes.
He's the instrument of God's authority, right? Okay, let's go a little bit blurry. So Donald Trump, where does he get his authority from? Even though it's for the people, from the people, by the people, does he get his authority from God?
Ultimately, yes.
Okay. Yes, kind of.
Isn't that part of the whole, isn't that the fundamental problem that at some points, I think, when I learned about it, it was about enlightenment figures, that there's this big switch where now governments get their power from below instead of from above.
Yeah. So one of the themes that we will talk a bunch about, and I want you to begin to look at the way the world works right now, you will notice very specifically that there's a lot that comes from below rather than from above. All right? Evolution, where does man come from? Below, right, rather than above. See how you begin to get people thinking about removing God from the equation. All right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about enlightenment in just a second, enlightenment thinking, without going deeply into it. So what I have this in a couple of slides in a minute, but well, as long as we're talking about it. So where did the people that elected Donald Trump fit in? Doesn't it seem like he works for the people? Or how does that work? Did I turn my authority over to him, my own personal autonomy over to him? And so that he has this sort of conglomeration of authority from all the people. All right, so think about it for a second, and we'll come back to it in a minute. All right, when I sort of lay out these other things, because you're all looking at me a little puzzled. All right, so remember, we're over on the right side of that chart, and now we're sort of looking at men as citizens. All right. And then we're sort of delineating, looking at the different different ways in which that authority is exercised. All right. All right. So we're going to go towards what Connor. Go ahead. What's your question? And we'll talk about what you brought up.
So where does God's authority come from? That might be a question that just goes with difference. Where if we were to say God has absolute authority, why?
You mean within the world?
Just I guess answer the question. I might be able to tell that.
Okay, so God's authority comes from the fact that He created the world and He holds it in existence. Like if you pin it down to that, I mean, the answer is God has authority because God is God, and we're all not. But if you were to sort of pin it down to like, okay, in what way can we say He has authority? Well, as the creator and sustainer of the world, He therefore actively manages it, and therefore ultimately has the say. Does that make sense?
We would say that authority, like let's say the authority of parents over their children. You didn't need the fourth commandment to know that you need the parents have authority over their children, correct?
Right.
So how does that come about other than just a prudential, like it doesn't make sense for children to just be allowed to run around and not have to listen to their parents?
Yeah. So how do you reason to it? In other words,
How do you naturally reason to it?
yeah, I mean, you would reason to it from the fact that, like exactly what we just said, like children don't know what the heck they're doing otherwise, right? And then so that the parents have to actually, educate them, and so there's all these frameworks of authority. So that's what's called paternal authority, and that's a type of authority that's meant to go away. So in other words, when it's exercised properly, the child is brought up and then can now sort of manage themselves, right? So as an adult, for your parents to still have authority over you, says there's either something wrong with you or something wrong with your parents, or both, right? Because once you grow up, that paternal authority there's still respect there, but the paternal authority goes away. I can't make demands on my adult children. Right?
So there's not as in the U.S. we have 18 as you're legally now an adult. So in reality, is there just kind of not necessarily we can put it down to a line. Is there just lying if you're under the authority of your parents? Or
yeah, I don't think you can't draw. Like I think it would be sort of I think if by 25, like if that's the case, but are there people from the range of 18 to 25 who, in some respects, are still under the authority of their parents? Yes. Yes, Casey.
So in the idea of you saying creator and sustainer, I feel like sustainer has a good influence on children, because if the child moves out of the house at 18 and does his own thing and has a job and is his own sustainer, the authority kind of goes away. But if the child is living.
I mean, it's exactly because it's what parents are, right? Like what John Paul II says about fatherhood, right? Like, fatherhood is to reveal and relive the very fatherhood of God, right? Fathers on earth should reveal and relive the very. So their authority comes from God, and at a certain point they have to turn that back over to God, right? Like they are only His instruments. Like as a father, I am only, and sometimes fathers do it well and they image it well, sometimes not, but still their authority doesn't. It's not just like they don't get it on their own. And it's the same thing like in marriage, right? Like the husband's authority over their wife, same kind of deal, right? Like it comes from Christ, and it can only be exercised. It's not an absolute authority. It only can be exercised in certain ways, and so forth. Guys, that makes sense. Did I answer your question, Connor?
Well, it's not.
Where did God's authority come from?
I'll probably just need to rest it.
Okay. All right. So, Leo the 13th says, okay, I don't want it to. So there is going to be a lot of maybe, for lack of a better word, like Protestant blaming this semester. Not in the sense of that like Protestants like now are to be blamed, right? But for us to understand like thought processes often come from deeply rooted sort of mistakes about reality. Okay, and the first sort of deeply rooted mistake that we made in Christendom was the Protestant Reformation, right? And it was most certainly, first and foremost, a crisis of faith, but it was also, there are sort of philosophical and reasoning errors that went on. Okay, and then there's consequences to what they're saying, all right? And so we're going to, especially living in what amounts to a Protestant-founded country, we're going to see like that some of those things will have to, those thought processes are embedded and will have to be sort of overturned, right? Like, why is America so materialistic, for example? Like, Americans just seem to be, for the most part. Why is that? Anyway, what do Calvinists, Puritans, what do they believe about material things? Anyone know? Yeah, so the predestined, the way you can tell you're predestined is to get up a whole bunch of stuff, right? That's what Calvinists believe, right? And how many Americans sort of see that as the highest value, right? Because those Puritans, they embedded it, right? They're like, okay, I can tell that I'm one of God's predestined because he blesses me materially. And so what does that mean? Well, you begin to work really, really hard because you want to get those material blessings because you want to show that you're predestined, right? And that is embedded in the American psyche, okay? So, and just to understand that, right? Just to understand that that's the way it is, all right? And that's what I mean by sort of Protestant. It's not bashing, but it's just understanding that you cannot understand the United States or the way out without an understanding the Enlightenment and specifically Calvinism, but just Protestantism in general. Right. All right. So here's what Leo XIII says. He says, sudden uprisings and the boldest rebellions immediately followed in Germany the so-called Reformation, the authors and leaders of which, by their new doctrines, attacked at the very foundation of religious and civil authority. And this was so fearful an outburst of civil war and with such slaughter that there was scarcely any place free from tumult and bloodshed. From this heresy there arose in the last century a false philosophy, a new right as it is called, and a popular authority, together with an unbridled license, which many regard as the only true liberty. Hence we have reached the limit of horrors, to wit, communism, socialism, nihilism, hideous deformities of civil society, abandonment, and almost ruin. All right, so what I want to maybe do for a second is we're just going to take the sort of generic Protestant understanding of private judgment. So just me and the Holy Spirit. What are the consequences of believing that? Well, go ahead.
The Bible can say what I wanted to say.
Huh?
The Bible can say what I wanted to say.
Yeah, so there's that. What do they have to do with...
Can you explain that idea?
Private... Basically, God speaks directly to me. I don't need any intermediary to talk to me. Ryan, you were going to say something?
Not just the Bible, but it can be in your own head. So if your subconscious starts talking to you, then you're going to agree with yourself.
Yeah, so I think that's an important point to not overlook. It's not that the Bible, it's really my interpretation of the Bible. So it's really could be me, right? All right, so what does that mean about authority?
There's no need for church authority.
No need for church authority, but what else?
Other authority.
No need for other authority, right? I am my own authority, right? I mean, that makes sense, right? So when I have a king, what does that mean? He maybe has authority. What if I don't like him?
I mean, that's fine.
Gone, right? It's not he's unjust or anything. I don't like him, he's gone. Right? If enough of us don't like him, he's gone. All right? And so what happens historically? Just that, right? Yes.
Is that your point about power from below? Is it's you're basically saying there is no authority over me. I am the authority.
Yeah. So now this is where we're going with that. Yes. The next step is okay, all power comes from me. I'm ceding my authority over myself to someone else. All right. And so then we get, and just so we're sort of, I'm not making this up. So this is what Luther says. All right. Between the Christian and the ruler, a profound separation must be made. Assuredly, a prince can be a Christian, but it is not as a Christian that he ought to govern. Right? Think about this for a second. Right? So he's saying, okay, Christianity has nothing to do with, how it's, it's almost like Machiavelli meets Calvin or something, right? Assuredly, a prince can be a Christian, but is not as a Christian that he ought to govern. As ruler, he is not called a Christian, but a prince. The man is a Christian, but his function does not concern his religion. Though they are found in the same man, the two states or functions are perfectly marked off, one from the other, and really opposed. So what did he just do? Go ahead, Ryan.
Well, that sounds very, very similar to how people framed JFK. I'm Catholic, but he made such a point to say, I will not be ruling as a Catholic. I am first and foremost president. Catholic is at home on the weekends.
Yeah, so that's the roots. No, that is absolutely the roots of it.
Yeah.
This is the personally opposed but. This is the first one. This is the root of it, right? But what has he done though? Go back to my picture. Yeah, so he begins to separate church and state, but then he also has separated Christ's kingship, right? Ultimately. Right? He's saying, okay, Christ is just ruler over here. He's just ruler over a bunch of us. We're not even really together. We don't really have a kingdom. I don't know what it is, but we just this invisible but he doesn't rule over here, right? So he's split it. Yes, Keaton.
It's also the same thing where we give Christ his authority because we submit to him, not he has authority over us. It's because I choose to be a Christian, Christ is my king, and only me.
Yeah, so not to sort of belabor that, but ultimately one of the problems with Protestantism, right, is they have faith in their faith, right? They're like, my faith saves me. My faith saves me, right? Not Jesus. My faith that my faith is strong enough for him to save me. So the faith is in the faith, which is sort of what Keegan is saying.
But
yes.
Catholics who are like, no, I can't do this by myself. It's entirely Jesus.
Yes, entirely Jesus, and I'm going to cooperate with him, right? Because he refuses to do it without me. Okay. All right. So yes, Connor.
Just not to belabor the gospel, but how does that work with the idea that there's also total depravity, where I also can't do anything good?
Well, yeah. So where does that fit into what he just said? It fits in there. Where does it fit in that? What does he say? Like, here's why he says that it's split. Right. Ultimately, is because the state is ultimately just a necessary evil, right? And the founders even say this. We'll talk more about this, right? Like, if you read the Federalist Papers, like, angels don't need government, right? It's only because we're fallen that we need government, rather than it being a natural institution, which the church would say, right? So yeah, total depravity means that everything goes on in the state doesn't matter. Like, it's just a bunch of fallen people, because now Christ isn't reigning there. So it's just a bunch of fallen people trying to get by, right? And you see all these sort of movements away from the church's teaching on economics, politics, all those things are thrown out with it, right? And so the Enlightenment, which we'll talk about in just a second, comes right out of the Protestant Reformation, right? It's just, they then took God out of the equation completely, right? So they said, okay, well, if he just reigns over there, that's private. You can just take that. You can do that by yourself. We're really just concerned about this because this is the only place we really interact with you. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the Enlightenment. Do you guys remember? I don't know if we talked about it last semester or not. What social contract theory is? All right. So if we're a bunch of sort of individuals, right, and we're not social by nature. The only thing that kind of brings us together is that we make some sort of agreement that we're all going to come together. All right. And this is where the authority, like if you live in this sort of, and Hobbes and Rousseau, they have little different viewpoints on what man is like, but they all agree that man over by himself is unfallen. It's society that corrupts him. So it's when they come together because they have needs and they bump into each other and they get when they bump into each other there's problems. So it's society that corrupts. Man isn't naturally corrupted, right? So that's a sort of key Enlightenment principle, right? Notice the theological error at the root of that already, right? Okay, so that assumes that if man isn't naturally drawn to society and he chooses to enter society, who has authority? The man himself, right? All right, and so this is now where we now get the whole idea that government comes from the people, like the power to govern comes from the people. All right, I mean, we could sort of really talk about this for a long time, but I don't want to sort of go deeply into it, but I think what Leo XIII says sort of summarizes. He says, indeed, very many men of more recent times, walking in the footsteps of those who in a former age assume to themselves the name of philosophers, say that all power comes from the people, so that those who exercise it in the state do not do so not as their own, but as delegated to them by the people, and that by this rule it can be revoked by the will of the very people by whom it was delegated. But for these, Catholics dissent, who affirm that the right to rule is from God and as from a natural and necessary principle. All right, so government is not sort of a necessary evil. Okay, it is natural. All right, it is natural to form a state, and it's natural to have authority. But yes, go ahead. You know what you're fine. Go, Casey.
So why did I guess besides the fact, so Samuel, people were like, we want a king. and he says, "You're rejecting me in wanting a king." So is that just like that? That's not necessarily always the case. It's only the case for them saying, like, because they were rejecting him. That, but like for other people, it would be natural to say we want a king as long as they see God as the true king.
Yeah, so he is ruler over that. So the reason why, just to look at it, so he's ruler over that single people. But this is, again, the model of the big thing, right? He's ruler over that single people. And so there's this blending of the temporal versus the eternal ruling, right? And he can do that because it's just a small people, right? But when Christ comes and offers it to the whole world, his rule is split, right? And so I think what God means by that is simply, I rule, and I'm ruling this way. It doesn't need to be changed, right? It's not necessarily so much the fact that it's like the kingship part doesn't matter, like the fact that they want a king. It's that they want something else other than the way God has set it up, and it's not necessary, like because God can rule through the judges for that group, for that chosen group of people.
We can't have judges anymore.
No, we still have to, because now there's differences in countries, right? Differences in what they need, what they're, what aspects of the common good, who can protect it, all that. Yes, Connor.
So the countries that are currently existing, they certainly have not always been here, and they didn't just a map didn't fall from the sky and said these are the borders. So how do we just say God's providence is how we arrive at these currently composed countries?
Yes. But very interestingly, if you're careful when you read the story of the Tower of Babel, when God separates everyone, you know how he decides to separate them? Who said it? Say that again. Whoever said it.
Nations?
Well, yeah, but how did he decide how many nations there should be?
How many angels?
How many angels there were, right? So how many guardian angels there were for the nations? Like, that's non-trivial, right? Because every nation, again, governed by a specific angel, right? So, and that's a part of government we won't necessarily talk about, but still, like, the church governed, like, angelically governed by St. Michael, and then all the other nations of the world are governed by angels too, right? Like, the children of Fatima, who do they meet first? The angel of Portugal, right? So there's an angel over Portugal. Yes, Andrew?
So was the number of angels over nations determined by the number that he knew would exist, or was the number of nations that would exist determined by the number of angels he created? Just X number.
It's like a yes on both, right? Like, it's God, and so he knows how many nations there will be and should be and are. Like, it's all the same thing. So I don't know that I can answer like it's almost a chicken and the egg kind of thing, right? Go ahead, Ray.
That shift, because obviously the nations that we have now were not the same as they were even 100 years ago.
Right.
Let alone,
yeah. So how does that work now?
we
Like,
just have an angel waiting room where they're hanging out. Before it's like,
yeah.
"Oh, where's the lesson?"
Well, no. What it means is that God has a vision.
Yeah.
God has a vision of different nations, and we may draw the lines differently, right? I think is what it more means, right? So in other words, like when there's all these little German states.
Yeah.
Sorry, the Italian got me with the hands. When there's all these different states, like German states, like did each one of them have a guardian angel? I don't know. Like did a guardian angel govern it? But in God's mind, there's a certain number of nations that are supposed to be united, and they're governed by angels. Like I don't know that. Like
there's a sufficient guardian angel count.
Yeah, I don't know. At all times, are there is the number of nations static? No, right? Obviously, so there's some kind of cooperation versus, but there is an absolute limit on the number of nations there will be, and I assume there's also an ideal number, which is that limit, I guess. Yes.
So I guess it's like how Poland in World War I didn't actually exist, but they're still like a Polish nation. But there's a guardian angel for the Polish people, even though there wasn't a country on the map.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, that the lines of Portugal changed, right? Like, and that angel was always over whatever Portugal is supposed to be.
So sort of that it doesn't makes sense that the angel over a nation doesn't have to have the same borders that we can see.
Exactly. All right. So, while I figure this out, I'm not sure why it's not working again. But anyway, so we were talking about just the idea of the divine right of kings, and the point is, all that we've said should make us sort of understand what the church isn't saying. The church isn't saying that there's a perfect sort of form of government. Okay, the perfect form of government is that which the most souls are saved, right? Like in a given area, right? So that's why there's the danger of imposing democracy on everyone, right? Now, if I believe authority comes from below, then yeah, I need to go out and democracy needs to be spread. But if I believe authority comes from above, I'm not so quick to do that, right? Yes, Connor.
But isn't there a form of government that most accurately reflects how things are in reality? If we say that authority doesn't come from below, then it seems like you can't say a democracy which kind of has as its base the principle of the majority rule and authority comes from below is a better government than something that reflects a divine order.
Yeah. I mean, from a divine order perspective, a monarchy would fit best, right? But that is discounting fallen human nature, right? So
there have been a lot more tyrants than there have, philosopher kings.
Yeah. So I mean, when the monarch is godlike, perfect, right? When he's, Lucifer-like, we've got a huge problem.
We have a king saint, right?
Oh, we have plenty of king saints. Yeah, and they're actually probably, I think, if I were to count up, there's more queen saints than there are king saints. If I had to guess, I would say that's definitely the case.
But we have King David, so.
Yeah, there is that. But they have Queen Mary. They have Queen Mary. I'm just saying.
I don't think they canonized Old Testament saints, but he's just considered a saint.
No, yeah. So they have canonized Old Testament saints. They're technically in Saint Moses, right?
Okay.
Yes.
We never refer to them that way. Eastern tradition, people do, Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholics refer to Old Testament Holy Figures.
Okay.
So the patriarchs are just more.
Yeah, I think they fall under the title of patriarchs, right? But technically they would be saints. Yes, right.
Kind of to get back to the monarchy would be best in theory, but then on human nature. So is it kind of reaching at it's subjective to the area of how it works. So having a monarchy to rule over the entire United States would be best because there are so many people. But in a smaller country, it works better.
Yes.
Yeah. To manage a smaller group.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it has to depend totally on, Connor. Go ahead, Papa.
So
I thought you guys got an arm wrestle or something. I thought it was coming.
You mumble just enough that Connor and Father sound just about the same.
So, are we saying the form of government that should be used is determined only by prudence and by what actually will?
Yes.
Is there not but there are certain governments that we would say are anarchy. I feel like we can
definitely strike down.
Yeah, well, that each government in its legitimate form has sort of a dark side to it, right? That it turns something else, right? So if the monarchy becomes a tyranny, right? The democracy becomes mob rule. And so each one of them has this sort of dark side when something goes wrong. And then the question is, and the reason why, someone like St. Thomas would say that monarchy is better, it's much easier to recover from a tyranny than it is from mob rule.
Because he was killed tyrant?
Yes. Yeah. Or he dies on his own. Whatever. Right? So it's one man that stands in the way, and one man who has to be virtuous versus in democracy a whole group of people have to be virtuous, right?
Well, the monarchy doesn't inherently mean a inherited monarchy. Right?
No, it doesn't need to. It doesn't need to at all, and that's one of the problems with it. But either way, the point is how the leader is chosen doesn't matter. Their authority still comes from God. right? And for that reason, we have to like respect that authority as if it's God speaking, provided that it's just. Right? And the point is like, yes, Father Josh, go ahead.
I just want to ask, where? I mean, this isn't the first time that I've heard it said that the best type of government is a monarchy, but where is that? I've never read that.
Yeah, so St. Thomas has a book it's called On Monarchy, where he sort of makes the argument for what is best. But
I would have thought like a patriarchy would be the best type of government.
It would totally depend on it would really depend absolutely. And part of his argument is, well, when God had the choice to set up his own government, that's what he chose, which makes sense, right? Like you're like, okay, this must be ideally the best if God chose it. But certainly, it would seem like a king with some kind of advisors with power. Like the fallen part of it is what really throws a monkey wrench into it, and why the church says, well, in theory this is the best, but in practice, all of these in the right circumstances are the best. Does that make sense?
What is the difference between a monarchy and a patriarchy?
Go ahead, you brought up patriarchy.
Well, I mean, you look at the Old Testament, and you look at Abraham, who was chosen by God to lead a group of people, and I think even, for example, Moses as well, and but he did, as you mentioned, Moses was advised as well. So he had advisors, he had counselors that helped him. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at the church
similar,
as a patriarchy, right? Like honestly, and not necessarily a monarchy, even though the papal tiara and the being crowned.
You say Pope, not King.
Yeah, I mean they're very similar, right? So
a lot of kings tended to have a group of advisors, anyways. So that's kind of where I'm getting.
Yeah, I think the difference would be in whether they held authority and were able to check against the king. Would be the difference.
Whether the advisors did, and that would be which, a monarchy?
That would be it would be some kind of ultimately with fallen human nature, the best is some kind of mixed regime, right? And depending on the people.
And I think a patriarch, there was more of an intermingling of the faith and the state.
Yeah.
Whereas with a monarch, I guess I haven't read St. Thomas's treatise on this, but I imagine he would have a close tie between them.
Yeah, and I think he would. I think from what I recall, it's been a long time since I've read it, but he does talk about Moses, for example, and he talks about how Moses was sort of pulled aside from he got overwhelmed trying to manage minutia, right? And then he ties it to the apostles, how there were sort of temporal things that needed to be done where they needed to devote themselves to building the church and to prayer and the sacraments. So they okay, we need to appoint someone that shares in our authority, and so they appoint the deacons. So that's the idea. Yes, Connor.
So if we say the purpose of all government is to preserve the common good, there are certain common goods that we know are, let's say, we can be pretty absolute about salvation.
Yeah, so the ultimate common good is God, right? That should be part of every society's common good.
And any government, he's giving the idea that any government can kind of go corrupt at some point. Does the church support the idea of, I guess like you said, the church having this kind of, ultimate check on everybody, in such a way that even if this person is just going off the rails, they speak for God essentially.
Yeah, I mean, and there's historical examples of it, right? How many times popes legitimately clashed with kings, right? That's Saint Ambrose is a good example, right? When the Roman Empire had moved to Milan, and he told the emperor he was going to excommunicate him, and the emperor got everything back in line. And actually had this huge conversion experience, and Augustine actually talks about him as the perfect, Christian prince. So ultimately, like in the end, it's the church that has authority over the king, and can check against him, but only in certain areas. All right. So third scripture passage: render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. Okay, what does Jesus mean here? All right, so let's put it in a sort of cultural context first, right? So, what is the current state of things when Jesus utters these words with relation to what is God and what is Caesar's? Everything is Caesar's, right? Pretty much, right? So what he's saying then is that Caesar has things that are his, but God has things that are just his. Right? And so what he's doing here is putting a check, to sort of build on what we were just talking about, putting a check on Caesar. Okay, saying Caesar only has limited things, right? Because ultimately, if Jesus were to answer this straightforwardly, what would he say? Everything is God's, right? Everything is God's, right? But what he's saying is Caesar only has certain things, because there's a tendency for the state to take over, right? And that's what Rome was, right? Like religion and state were together. Okay, they were one thing, right? And it will always be that way without a check. Okay, this is what, like, if we're sort of honest, this is what we're seeing in our own country now, right? Like, what is becoming the national religion?
Agnosticism?
No, it's like this humanitarianism, right? Like tolerance. That's a humanitarian value, right? Like, what do all of us have to do? What do corporations have to do? You have to say the right things. You don't have to believe them, but you have to offer your pinch of incense to Caesar, right? It's political correctness. And so you see, once God gets pushed out of the equation, what happens? The state just grows and grows and grows and grows, right? Because that's fallen humanity, right? There's no check. When it comes from below, it grows like a fungus and just keeps going, right? When it grows from above, there's a ceiling on it, all right? And that's what Jesus means by it.
When you say from below, do you mean like,
from the people?
Okay. I was wondering if you meant like from devils or something like that.
Well, I mean, ultimately, right? Like,
if it's not God, then
yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. If it's not good, then it's bad. So.
All right. So with that idea, okay, the church already invented the idea of a separation of church and state a long time ago, right, in the 5th century. All right. And so what I want to do for the rest of the time, talk about what that actually means. Like a proper understanding of it, okay? Because you could see how, obviously, how we might not want King Henry VIII to be supreme over the church, right? But it isn't always clear why we may not want the Pope to be supreme over all the secular things, okay? All right, so, yes?
Would you say we're getting that wrong?
What do you mean?
In a general sense, like, I've seen controversial conversations about maybe the bishop shouldn't be so concerned about social issue X, especially in America. It's just, yeah.
I mean, I know eventually that this question would come up, and in general, the church can have a habit of wasting their moral authority by getting too closely aligned with either political parties or more so to different like maybe laws or whatever, right? Like, okay, there's this proposal on the table. Is it moral? Okay, yes, it is. Then the church is done. Like the church, the hierarchy of the church is done. Like, because Christ exercises authority in the temporal reign. How? Not through them, right? And so when they do that and they speak about things of which they don't really have that charism, it makes it seem like, oh, well, he's just giving his opinion, and so therefore when he talks about contraception, he's also just giving his opinion, right? So they have to be careful about not sort of wasting their moral ammunition by talking about everything and anything. I mean, the role of the church specifically with respect to that is to sort of serve as a conscience and go, this is immoral, this is moral. But to go and say, well, this particular budget is not the best way to do this. They have no business doing that. None. Even if they're right. It doesn't matter, right? If you may remember, this was probably 4 or 5 years ago. The Speaker of the House was Paul Ryan, who's a pretty faithful Catholic, and they had developed a budget, and some of the bishops didn't like what he had in the budget. And so they called him out on it, and he called them out and said, well, where have I contradicted Catholic social doctrine? And then he gave out this long sort of defense in Catholic social terms why everything he was saying was just. And ultimately the bishops had to back down, and that's terrible, right? Because they lost. I mean, I'm sure it broke his heart to do that, but they ended up losing a lot of moral authority by doing that. So they have to be really careful about, like things like immigration, right? Like that's way more complicated than, and we'll talk more about it, but they have to be really careful about talking about that, right? Because ultimately, I mean, this is what we're talking about. Like what Jesus says in the gospel isn't the way to govern a state, right? Like welcoming the stranger, he doesn't mean that entire countries are. It's not a social program, right? It's like if somebody attacks our country and we all just stand up and go, we're turning the other cheek, like that's wrong, right? So you have to be careful that you apply them in the way that they're meant. All right. Yes.
Sort of thinking of like people in the church know stuff in the church. People in the church don't always understand economics to the full extent. So the church should stay in its lane. Like Jesus rules over everything. The church.
Well, so Jesus rules over the economic realm.
Yeah.
Through the land.
Through Catholic.
Yeah.
Econometricians, right?
Those are the words.
Yeah.
Not Catholic statisticians.
I had trouble with that one. No, that's the point. Like, that's why you're here, right?
Yeah.
Like, because you're like, okay, how does Christ reign over, Catholic hospitals? How does Christ reign over? That's what we have to decide and discover and then implement, right?
It's written really well in the Catechism, actually, about like the role of the laity and. Maybe I could read that again.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, like the role of like priests and bishops is to form the Catholics so that they can go out in the world and change the world, right?
So like Paul Ryan having the budget that worked well was an example of doing well.
Yeah, I mean, he took exactly what he thought, what he thought was, had solid Catholic ground, and then he said, well, this now is the prudential way in which this needs to be implemented, because he had the practical prudence to do it, not his bishop. Yes, Con.
So what is the role of bishops then? Are we saying there, as I see from something else, that like there's a risk of being pushed back to now, okay, well, you can sit, like you can sit in your cathedral and you can kind of, write your moral theories about how economics should be run. But really, we know what's going on, and we're just going to do it the way that we think it should be done. And it's great if you agree with us.
Who's the we? Is the we the Catholics or the everyone else?
Let's say, I guess you could make an argument that that's the first error. That's an error in trying to assert moral authority over non-Catholics by making statements from Catholic bishops. Because I'm more thinking like politicians in general.
Yeah, so, in general, like, bishops have authority over everyone in their diocese, not just Catholics, right? Like, Father Joshua has authority over every student on this campus.
Yeah.
Like, that's pretty, that's daunting, right? But that's the reality. So when he speaks with the voice of Christ and has legitimate authority, all of those things, right? So I think there's nothing wrong with bishops speaking about, like, you take someone like Fulton Sheen, right? Like, it was really important what he did. And he could do it because of where he was and his specific set of skills, and he had some credibility because he was a bishop. This is not a, like, hey, you need to stay in your lane kind of thing, per se. Even though they do need to stay in their lane, but their lane is not really narrow, right? So, like, they need to, but what should happen is, like, their goal should be to get you or me to go out and take care of it, right? So that, they may have to lead the way initially, like a shepherd, but ultimately they should say, okay, I need to step away now because they've got this.
I mean, I think, wouldn't it just go back to, like, just any of us, like, I don't know, just being humble. Like, you know, if I don't have the ability to do X, I shouldn't go and try to solve that problem.
Yes.
So it's
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, it's exactly it. Right?
So you'd say their lane being morality means like, so like when you say talking about economics, like when it comes to morality and economics, like whether or not, you know, socialism is a moral principle, their lane is still, or their lane has become economics because it is, you know.
Yeah, because it ties directly to like salvation of souls, ultimately.
Lane is probably a bad analogy, but yes, because that's the other danger is they're like, oh, just stay in your lane, don't say anything about politics.
Yeah.
You know, if it becomes a moral issue, then it is good business.
It's a moral
That's-
issue versus implementation detail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a lot of the, like, we talk about, I mean, just to say in the U.S., like you mentioned with immigration, I think it seems like the bishops talk about immigration as much as they do about abortion, or more than. And one is a prudential decision with guiding principles, and the other one is a moral absolute. And so, like, the second one is like, okay, definitely affirm that. But when you have guiding principles, affirm the principles, for sure.
Yeah, and you just have to be careful about, like, there's always and we'll talk about this when we talk about, there's a heresy called Americanism, which you guys may or may not know about, but we'll talk about it. But there's always this danger of thinking, well, if I just show them how reasonable I can be about something, then they'll start listening to me, and you know, you start sort of like pushing a little bit in that direction, right? Like, okay, they're really talking about the environment now, so let's really focus on that. Because there's moral implications there, and if they see we're right on this, then maybe they'll start listening to us about the unborn. Rather than just going, well, why can't we talk about both? And, you know, so there's always a danger, and this happens in our culture a lot, where there's the grouping of moral issues into one, like, they're all the same, right? Like, for example, this is a pet peeve. In Mass this morning, they prayed for an end to abortion, euthanasia, and capital punishment. All right? Those are not the three on the same three levels, right? Now, would it be great if none of the three of those things were needed? Or see what I just did? Like, one of them is a question of whether it's needed. The other two are absolutely can never happen, right? And when you begin to equate those, people walk away going, "Oh, well, this guy's fake because he's in favor of the death penalty, but he's talking about abortion." Like, really?
Right.
So you have to be really careful about equating moral issues.
And that's the big thing with anti-pro-life movement arguments, or whatever, because they're like, oh, you're anti-abortion, well, what about immigration, socialized healthcare, and all this other stuff?
I went to see the movie Just Mercy the other night, and if you guys know what this is about, it's about a guy who was on death row, unjustly accused.
It was a common reading my freshman year.
Yeah, so you know the story pretty well. So in the end, I'll ruin it for you. Shocker, but he's exonerated and he gets out. Right, and so we're leaving the
movie if they killed him.
We're leaving the theater, and this woman's walking out in front of me, and she turns to the woman beside her and goes, "Man, like Alabama's so backwards." And immediately my ears picked up, and she's like, "Yeah." The other one was like, "Yeah, that's where if you get raped, they won't let you have an abortion." The woman just spent 2 hours watching a movie about somebody who was unjustly caught up in someone else's crime and about to get killed, and she thinks they're backwards for that, never making the connection. So, like, it's really important you're able to make those connections, right? I mean, that's a big blind spot, right? And so we can't waste our moral capital saying things, and we have to be really careful. Yes.
So this is a larger question that probably won't be answered now. So one of the things you talked about at the beginning of this was about being able to talk to people about things. So how do you go about convincing someone that, like I saw it on my Facebook, whatever it's called, multiple times recently, about the idea that, like, you know, like, never trust a politician who tells you how to pray, or a pastor who tells you how to vote. So, like, how do you fight back against the idea that, we need to have religion explaining how we should engage in the public?
Yeah, I think it just depends on who you're talking to, right? So, like if you're talking to other, like, I know you guys had a little trouble, like, selling this to some people, right? Like, selling the idea that, like, I don't worry about, I don't talk about that, right? I think from that perspective, you begin to ask the question of, well, okay, where does your faith stop? Where's the line? and then you kind of make them walk the line back, and then they say, well, hold on a second, like Christ the King, like he's king over everything. That's ultimately where you're going to move somebody to. If they're from the other direction, which we can talk a little bit about, what happens. So when you look at the state, an analogy will help. When you look at the state, right? It's sort of it's analogous to the human body, right? It's the here and the now, the temporal things, right? It sort of governs the temporal things, and the soul sort of is the eternal thing, and it's governed by the church, right? What happens when you separate body and soul?
Yeah.
Death. What do we see is actually, what is a culture of death? Yeah, where those two things are separated, right? Where those two things are separated, right? So that would be the direction I would lead someone coming from the other direction to. Just to kind of see, well, hold on a second, like, how can I live compartmentalized like that? I can't. No one can, right? And that, I think, is again, it would depend on the person and all that, but that would be the direction I would try to show that it sort of leads to a culture of death.
We made it back to the slide. Separation of church and state. We made it back.
I did. I actually did. Good. Yeah, I'm so lost at this point. Let me see what I can draw from this, because it is after 6 o'clock. Okay, so throughout history, let's talk about this for just a second, and then we'll move to the very last slide. So throughout history, you guys may or may not know this. So for a long time, Catholics couldn't hold public office in the United States for a long time, right? Until like last century, even in some places. And you know why that was?
Because they thought it was they framed it as like this political thing where, well, you actually answer to the Pope, so we can't have you running our country because you won't answer to the country.
So why was that wrong? Like, who actually makes the best politicians? Go ahead, Ryan. Answer my first question first, because that's what you were saying.
Why it's incorrect is because as Catholics, as a Catholic, I don't answer to Pope Francis, I answer to God.
Okay. And as a Catholic president or a Catholic senator, who would you answer to?
God.
Yeah. So who is the best politician? Catholic, right? Like, because who does a non-Catholic or who does a Protestant? Who do they answer to? The people, right? But ultimately, like, so in other words, there is no. As a Catholic, I'm not pulled in two directions at all. Everyone else is, because all authority comes from God. Yes.
I'm not convinced by that argument.
Why not?
Because
on their end or his argument?
His argument. Because, like, say I'm a Protestant, I would be afraid of a Catholic becoming president and the Pope. Again, like kind of what you're saying. Like, so if the Pope threatened to excommunicate me as a president, I'm gonna change what I'm doing. And so I don't think it's a unreasonable fear.
Oh no, I meant, like, honestly though, like we're the only ones who can do that, right? Like, because of the way. Yeah, I don't.
You're not saying it's a good thing.
From their perspective,
okay.
We're saying the same thing.
Okay.
Yes, Connie.
It's good that they're terrified.
Well, it just goes back to a distrust in God that we all have as a result of original sin.
I mean,
Well, no, they distrust the church because the church was an authoritarian leader for so many centuries, and they, especially with the start of America, they were tired of monarchical authorities.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
and
the
that.
whole reason
We'll talk more about that, but just the sort of move away from monarchy too is really important for understanding people's attitudes towards the church. What were you going to say, Connie?
Now, we are speaking here of, like, philosophically perfect Catholics and philosophically perfect Protestants.
Yeah, they would actually care if the Pope threatened to excommunicate them. Yes.
That is
like
also,
JFK as president, like, was he a Catholic?
Yeah.
Well, even in the sense of, I would not be surprised if there are Protestant politicians who would say, "Oh yeah, I serve God. I'm good." They might not be. They might not really. They might align more with Catholic philosophy than they realize.
Yeah, no, it's I don't. Again, like the broad, like we talked about this before, but like the Reformation happened like a long time ago, and like we can hold all of them culpable for all of that and their bad ideas. Like when you've just inherited bad ideas and you don't question them because why would you question them? That's a totally different thing, right? And so very often, I mean, you'll meet Protestants who are really close to being Catholic. I mean, in their thinking and everything, right?
They just don't know that's what being Catholic is.
Yes. All right. So one last slide, and then we can stop. I want to talk about real quick about obviously there's going to be times when we're going to be doing a little bit of sort of America bashing, right? And it might even make you feel a little bit bad about it. So what I want to talk about is what the virtue of patriotism actually is. Okay. All right. What is patriotism? Like if you had to define patriotism to someone, what would you say?
Love for your country.
All right. What does that mean? That is exactly the definition.
Desire the good of the country as the country.
Casey, you totally cheated, dude. You just put in. So, what does it mean to love your country? Do you love the land, the actual physical land you're standing on?
Hopefully that too.
I mean, yeah, but
Sort of, like just like you love your home, right? Like you love your house, you love your home, not necessarily your house, but you love your home. But it's more than that, right? Do you love your because you're a patriot? Do you love your mayor?
But not quite in the sense I think you are.
I'm being deliberately vague. I haven't defined a single term yet, if you notice. I want to sort of wrestle with this a little bit, right? So when St. Thomas talks about patriotism, which is what I've got up here, he groups it in the fourth commandment with love of your parents, with piety, love of your parents.
Yeah,
all right.
I always wondered why it falls under piety.
Yeah. So what the reason is that he takes you have a distinct love for your family, right? That's piety. What does love for your neighbor actually look like? So he's like, okay, stop being so abstract about love of neighbor. What does it actually look like? Right? And he says, okay, that's piety or patriotism, where you love the people of your fatherland. Okay, actually like love them in the gospel sense, right? Not like have warm feelings towards them. Not, yes, Lizzie.
What's the difference between patriotism and nationalism?
Yeah, so again, nationalism is one of those things that is kind of an obscure word, but in the sense of like Hitler with nationalism, for example, would just be like patriotism would never hate anyone else, right? You love your country because it's your country and the people of your country, but that doesn't imply that you have to hate other people. Like nationalism in that sense always implies that I have to hate the other. So I think that would be the difference. Does that make sense?
The shorthand way to think of it is as toxic patriotism.
Yeah.
It's an extremely simplified way of putting it.
Would some of the values and good of nationalism fall under a trait of patriotism?
Sure. I mean, truthfully, we told if you asked Hitler, he would have said, "I'm just a patriot," right? And some of the things he did were patriotic, right? And the fact that but he took way took it to an extreme beyond all things, right?
Or think of it like patriotism is loving your country, just think of it like the people in your country. But nationalism would be like loving the people in your country, and that anyone else outside of that is terrible. Is that
that's exact. I mean, for nationalism from that sense, but there's a push now, especially as the American apology tour continues, where people they're saying, well, nationalism is a good thing, and so there's a little change in the kind of the way it's used.
The American apology tour.
If you've not been around the world,
no,
everyone is always apologizing for being American.
Oh, that's what you mean. I thought you meant in the apologetic sense.
Which
is kind of also happening.
Yeah.
You must be American too.
One of the things we talk about all the time, in terms of the frustration of the modern world, is we say you think love means support. So you could say I love my brother who struggles with same-sex attractions by calling to something greater. So in that sense, when you said you love your mayor, I love my mayor, but it doesn't mean I have to support my mayor and everything. It might mean that I would call my mayor out for unmale.
Right. Yeah, so willing the good when there's something that's this is the point, right? To be a patriot, to will the good of other people in America means you have to be critical of it when it needs to be critical. You have to tell, no, that's wrong, or that's broken, or that won't work, or all of those things. That's love of neighbor demands that, right? That's patriotism.
So it's like a family but bigger.
Yeah, how you go to your families at on holidays, right? And there's people you just you don't see eye to eye. If you really love that person, you will duke it out. You'll figure it out.
I'm in brother of Christ sense. I was not like saying something
yeah,
like
that's
fine.
Can you clarify? So in this passage, Jerry's using, he says like worship your parents and like.
Yeah, he doesn't mean it in the sense of.
Okay.
I mean, because at the top he says you worship first God, right?
Yeah.
Did I include that part? Yeah.
It's a translation thing.
No, I mean it's a word that means to give honor to.
Yeah. Yeah, we use the term worship differently than St. Thomas is using it. And it's just translated differently. I mean, think of it as veneration, if it helps veneration. Like you venerate your parents.
Yeah, I also have another question. So I've heard our bishop multiple times talk about like, you know, saying something like, "Oh man, I love pizza." He's like, "I love God, I love my neighbor." Done. You know,
yeah.
That's it. You know, and like, you know, I like pizza, I like the food or whatever. But like, it seems like a lot of the saints use it more as like, you know, I sin, well, I love my sin. You know, I like the pizza, so I love my pizza. You know, I love God, so I love God. You know, kind of more like, I don't know.
Yeah, so remember we talked last semester about an analogy? Like,
yeah.
Like certain terms are analogous. Love is one of those terms, right? Like I can say that I love pizza. I love my dog. Which would be a lie, but I love my wife. I love God. God is love. Like I'm using all saying there's overlap in those things, but they're all vastly different from each other. Right? And so it's the same idea.
Is king analogous?
An analogous term? Yes. Yeah, I would say because anything that can be applied to God is an analogous term. Right? So you get a glimpse of it through. You know, that's the whole purpose of like the sacramentality of creation, right? Is to get a glimpse of the analogous, like you know, God is analogously Father. Like He's really the true Father, and I'm analogous as a father only insofar as I am a sacrament of Him. Connor.
So with the worship due to parents and worship due to, let's just for clarity, let's say honor. To your parents, the honor to your country. Does that stem? So you talked about like a debt. The idea, okay, you owe your parents, and does that debt extend purely from the like existence? Like so, your parents gave you existence in a certain sense. I mean, that implies like a certain amount of debt there. Does it grow and diminish with? Let's say you have horrible parents, or something like really actually horrible parents, or your country is communist Russia, or something like that, where you're
saying is there a point where the authority ends?
Not necessarily. I mean, there's certainly a point where the authority ends in terms of if they're ordering you to do something moral. But is the honor? I was having this discussion with somebody, in which I was saying, okay, well, there's a certain honor to your parents, just as your parents, and I wasn't sure if that honor can increase or diminish depending on how good of a parent they actually are.
I would say no. I would say that obviously your desire to honor them would be proportional to like how they were. So in other words, you're drawn to honoring them more. But the actual what is due to them doesn't change.
Even though I think one could argue the debt that you incur, the debt of gratitude that you incur to them, can vary between. Because I would like existence, obviously, a pretty big one.
Yeah. Yeah. So from that perspective, from the perspective of the debt of gratitude, it can change. But honor is more than just the debt of gratitude, right? So I think there is I think there is certainly a minimum that's owed to them no matter what, no matter how bad they were or how bad they are. But it can keep going because they have more. They have more glory in the earthly sense attached to them, right? And so they're more worthy of honor.
So it can vary, but
there's an absolute minimum, but it can vary from there, from the minimum up.
How much?
The minimum is pretty high.
If someone owes their parents.
That's a great question. Like I don't know. I have a clear answer. I mean, I think I've shared with a lot of you. Like, I didn't have a great growing up situation with my dad and everything. But because he was my dad, when he got sick, I made sure he was taken care of, and I made sure I visited him. And he didn't appreciate it at all, at all. I would go and I'd stay for, we'd all get in the car and I'd go and stay for 5 minutes and go, drive 2 hours, stay 5 minutes, and he'd be like, "Thanks for stopping by." but that was fine because in the end, I gave him what I thought was owed to him, right? Whereas, like, my sisters didn't do that because of just the horror of the situation. And not that I begrudge him of that, but that I felt that there was a certain amount of that. The fact that he gave me existence, I did get food, I did get, taken care of. Like, I owe him. Like, he didn't owe me that at all, and so I owed him something. I mean, certainly he owed me. Like,
once he created you,
yeah, to give me. Like, I'm just saying, like, he didn't owe me any of that. Like, it was gratuitous. Like, my existence was gratuitous, right? The extra clothes I had were there were gratuitous things I received. So I think that they're, in the end, like, when you're talking to people about that, like, just in general, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about per se, but in the end, like, my dad passed away, and I have a clear conscience about it. So in the end, you just have to just go, what am I going to feel good about 20 years from now? Like, and yeah, did I overdo it? Like, does it matter that I maybe overdid it? Like, who cares in the end, right?
The good part about the spiritual life is that if you overdo a good thing, it's just still a good thing.
Yeah. So, like, when you're talking, like, if that's where the question, if it's not just a theoretical question.
No, it's definitely a theoretical.
Yeah. So if it's more than then the answer is there's a minimum amount no matter what. But, like, a practical way, like, the person needs to understand that, like, you have to live with your decision, like, for the rest of your life, and you don't want to be the one who, decided that, I wasn't going to give them what they owed because, and it speaks of forgiveness, all those things, right? Like, yes.
Almost in a reverse situation, how, when you do something against your parents' will that still needs to be done, how would you practically give honor? Like,
so is it like something that's so I guess that something would really obviously matter.
Well, also obedience and honor are different things.
Yeah. So that would be the first thing, like the obedience. Like, do you owe them obedience? And you guys are all in that sort of like in between stage, right? Like, except for one of you. One of you owes absolute obedience to his parents.
I thought that went away when you were the parent.
So anyway, but yeah. So it would just depend. Like,
yeah. Oh yeah, it's this one.
Yeah. whether
I know.
obviously if they're telling you to do something bad, but if they're telling you to do something and you think there's a better way to do it, or
like you want to do something and they're like, no, you shouldn't do this, and you're like, nah, like I really should. How would you in doing the thing that is good?
Yeah, like is the person like you and your age, like where you are?
Me right now. I'm
you should do like you're an adult. Like you're an adult and like for the most part.
I've generally heard like the honor, like you can give honor by listening to as an adult, like you can listen to what your parents.
Yeah, you wouldn't just like you don't blow them off. You don't like you explain. I'm still going to do this because and blah blah blah, and you try to be extremely respectful. But at a certain point, when you become an adult, you can legitimately disagree with your parents about something, and that
doesn't take away the honor.
No. To disagree is not to take away the honor, right? Like understanding that. Like I honor my wife, but I'll disagree with her. And same thing, right? And if it's not something that's like bad or something that like my reason isn't much better for why it should be that way. If it's just kind of like I think it's good for this reason. I don't think it's good for this reason. Ultimately, like you're the one who has to answer for what you do and don't do, right? As an adult. So
and think about it, like as you get even older in your parents' age, if disagreeing took away the honor, then how would you take care of an ailing parent who doesn't know what's best for them? Right.
So. Lizzie, what were you going to ask a question?
I was just going to say, like, there's a point where you're honoring and serving, providing for your parents, where you're always doing what they want and, like, pleasing them and not necessarily making sure you're following the will of God, where you put your parents above God.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a danger, too, right? For sure.
Yeah, but the whole authority comes from God thing is still in the family. Every time you say something about how dads image God the Father, I get really nervous.
Well, I mean, every male in this room ought to shiver a little bit.
Yeah. It's just like,
should shiver at that.
It's real.
Yeah. Because if you look at yourself, what is your primary image of God? It would be really hard to sort of disentangle it from how your dad was. That's just the reality. Right? All right, questions, comments? All right, so on the if there's stuff that you guys want to talk about, let me know, and I'll make sure we cover it. Yes.
This is something definitely for after. I want to talk to you about teachers.
About what?
I was trying to understand what we talked about last.
Let's just talk about that.
All right, anybody other than Connor have a question? All right, who wants to pray then? Oh, Andrew, you have a question?
Really quick one, since we were just talking about what patriotism means. I'm hoping this won't actually drag us down the rabbit hole. I really hate the phrase, if you don't like this country, then leave. To context aside, what is your opinion of that phrase?
I would say that, yes, the context does matter. I would say in general, patriotism demands if something's broken, you point it out and try to fix it. So that doesn't make someone a patriot because they don't like the way something is being done in the country, right?
Would there something to be said for if you disagree with the fundamental?
And that's where I would draw the lines. Like if it's something.
Yeah, I think it really depends. I think it really depends. Again, it depends on if it's a fundamental thing that really is broken and needs to change. Then yeah, I mean.
But then it becomes a credential. Are you in a position to change it? Do you have other obligations? Like people fleeing a war-torn country, I wouldn't say they're not patriots. I'm saying they're taking care of their lives first and kind of.
Yeah, I mean all of that being said, right? But in general, I'm not a fan of the somebody criticizes something and.
Someone wanted to change.
Yeah, I mean, whether I agree with them or not shouldn't matter. But hey, why don't you leave if you don't like it? That's not how to handle it.
Do you see a similar thing with the church idea? Like when someone criticizes specific actions in the church, it's somehow you shouldn't criticize because that somehow is bad.
A lot of it is in how we do the criticizing.
Yeah, like 90% of it in a lot.
And I've been reading St. Teresa of Avila lately. Not her actual writings because apparently they're really hard to read, but other comments through the writes